Welcome to this quick guide on AQA Paper 2, Question 4, a comparison of writers' viewpoints and perspectives. Hopefully by the end of this video you will have a better idea than you have currently about how to make the most of the 16 marks available for this question. The question is about viewpoints and perspectives, and I think this image here illustrates that really well. It's quite a famous idea. It's called the blind men and the elephant, and as you can see from the image, each man is a different part of the elephant, and they think of the elephant as something completely different, and that's what perspective is. So when you talk about somebody's perspective, you have to consider where they're standing, not just literally, but in time, and how who they are affects their opinions on things and what their role is. And it's really important that you get to the absolute nitty gritty of somebody, the writer's point of view when you're looking at these two different texts. Because remember, you're going to get a pre-19th century text and a modern text. So they're going to be quite different in perspective. So somebody who writes about a topic in the 19th century will have a completely different point of view about the thing that they're writing about than somebody in the 20th or the 21st century, because life has changed so much. It can be impacted also by things like gender. So a woman writing in the 21st century is going to be quite different than a man writing in the 19th century. So perspective, all those things that you're told at the beginning of the text before you even read it are really crucial, because they can give you a lot of key ideas to do really well on this particular question. These are the success criteria for question 4. It's about talking about viewpoint. So it's important that you look at the writer viewpoint for both the texts, because it is a comparison. You can start with one, write about that, and then obviously move on to the second and make your comparisons then, or you can do an integrated comparison. But provided you talk about the viewpoints of both writers and you make comparison points, you are covering the success criteria. In addition to that, as you would expect, you have to quote evidence from both texts and talk about the methods and devices the writer is using. So that is knowledge about language. So that would include actually using proper technical vocabulary. You have to show analysis. You have to talk about the methods and how they illustrate the writer's viewpoints and intentions, and actually show that you understand how the language works and how the choices made by the writers work. But this is a comparison question. You cannot just talk about the text in isolation. You have to make some comparison points. Just so you're aware of what it actually looks like on the exam paper, it will almost be word for word like what you can see on the screen at the moment. You need to refer to the whole of source A together with the whole of source B. Compare how the writers convey their different ideas and perspectives of the events that they describe. So the word convey means to show, and it actually refers to the techniques that they use. And that is reinforced again in the bullet points. So you've got compare the different ideas and perspectives. So that's your key ideas point. And then the methods is the second bullet point. In other words, language techniques, quoting examples. And obviously you don't quote examples, it's very difficult for you to show an understanding of the methods that writers use. Some top tips here. Try to make sure you've got more than one quotation. I would say at the very least 3 from each text. Explain the quotations, but even more than that, actually analyze them. You don't just say what they mean in your own words. Actually get under the skin of what how the language works as well. To do that, zoom in on key ideas and explore the way the language works. Always refer to subject terminology. Using comparatives and connectives is a way that you show that you're making a comparison. So link the ideas between the two texts, and that will get you a higher mark because you're showing that you can compare. So the first text is called The Cholera Near Golden Square, and it comes from 1854. I think it's actually fairly well known. It's a doctor called Dr. John Snow, and it's about a cholera epidemic, which he investigated and actually, I believe, came up with the solution for. So I'll quickly read it. The most terrible outbreak of cholera which ever occurred in this kingdom is probably that which took place in Broad Street, Golden Square, and the adjoining streets a few weeks ago. Within 250 yards of the spot where Cambridge Street joins Broad Street, there were upwards of 500 fatal attacks of cholera in 10 days. The mortality in this limited area probably equals any that was ever caused in this country, even by the plague, and it was much more sudden, as the great number of cases terminated in a few hours. The mortality would undoubtedly have been much greater had it not been for the flight of the population. Persons in furnished lodgings left first, then other lodgers went away, leaving their furniture to be sent for when they could meet with a place to put it in. Many houses were closed altogether, owing to the death of the proprietors, and in a great number of instances the tradesmen who remained had sent away their families, so that in less than 6 days from the commencement of the outbreak, the most afflicted streets were deserted by more than 3/4 of their inhabitants. There were a few cases of cholera in the neighbourhood of Broad Street, Golden Square, in the latter part of August, and the so-called outbreak, which commenced in the night between the 31st of August and the 1st of September, was, as in all similar instances, only a violent increase of the malady. Okay, so that's the first text. Now, the first thing you will know about the text, if you're talking about the writer's viewpoint, is that he is a doctor, and it's important to consider why he's writing the text. So you are told in the blurb at the beginning that he's investigating the outbreak. And if you actually look at some of the language used, it's not particularly emotive. There are a couple of bits that you could home in on, like he calls it a terrible outbreak, and we got the reference to violent increase at the end. But there's certainly not an emotional response to the loss of life. In fact, if you look at the language used, you can see highlighted there. We've got in turquoise outbreak of cholera, mortality in this limited area, another reference to mortality. We've got the death of the proprietors. We've got the word afflicted and the word malady. So all those words are to do with illness and death, but they're very much lacking in any kind of emotion. They're simply descriptions of death. We've also got some language which is very kind of formal, written in a kind of report style, just because this is a professional man giving a detailed and accurate account of what he saw in this particular outbreak. That's also backed up by some of the language, which is very statistical. So you look at all the things there in the purple highlighting. We've got very precise references to distance in 250 yards. We've got a reference to the number of attacks, 500 fatal attacks. The greater number of the cases terminated in a few hours, so references to time there. And again, a reference to a longer period of time, less than 6 days from the commencement. So that use of way of measuring things fairly accurately shows that kind of formal tone to this particular writer. So very much his point of view is one that is professional and not detached, but certainly not particularly emotional. To compare that, we've got a second text also about illness, but this is from a completely different perspective, and that perspective, even before we look at the examples, I'm sure you can see, will be completely different, because this is a ward sister on a COVID ward, and it's a modern extract, and it's her personal experiences. So already before you read the extract, you know that this person has had a completely different experience than the doctor in the first extract, because she actually works on the ward. And obviously, if you're personally involved in treating the ill, that's going to have a different impact. So let's see if you can pick out the language features here and how they might be different. It started as a storm in a distant place where we could only sense the faintest of winds drifting our way. Within 6 weeks, this storm was to become our entire focus and unearth us from our normal lives. The preparation was starting to build with speed as images came from Europe of endless beds in the Spanish Museum, of army trucks in Italy carrying bodies away from overwhelmed hospitals, and stories of horrendous ethical choices having to be made on a daily basis to rationalise care. We were briefed that this was soon going to be our reality, our hell. I then began to experience the most amazing, humbling and incredible teamwork in my team, in our hospital team and in our trust as a team. Daily briefings from our exec team issued details to guide us, central hubs set up immediately to centralise resources, and senior command teams appearing on our ward supporting us. Guidelines changed by the hour, which was so stressful to keep on top of, but everyone was in the same boat and we simply did our absolute best. Being resourceful became absolutely key. We had to set up as many isolation cubicles as we could for potentially positive and confirmed positive children, so we decommissioned all our outpatient rooms within a day. The playroom was packed up and emptied and set up as a 5-bedded bay ready to receive additional patients. Oxygen and beds came in, toys went into storage, and we even found handbells to use as call bells. I realised we could use my own two-way radios I used on the campsite in France with my children, so families could call us from their isolation cubicle to the desk. This gave a moment of light humour as children radioed us, making up their call signs through the day and night. The news was coming in of the demand for ventilator spaces for adults. I welcomed the adult ITU team onto our children's ward to see if we could support this need. Clipboards appeared and oxygen demands calculated. We were able to offer 8 adult ventilated bed spaces on the children's ward if needed. We planned in preparation how we would welcome the adult team onto our children's ward and how we would best support them. The pace was intense and the need to reassure staff was huge for me. As a ward sister, I'm in the privileged position of knowing my staff and being their leader. I could see the stress building and so I wanted to reassure my team. I drafted an emailed letter to my team and I checked this letter with a friend in the military who took his soldiers into Afghanistan. I wanted it to echo the rallying nature of a commander taking his troops to war, coupled with understanding and reassurance. I sent the email to my nurses and our consultants and found I had a flood of lovely emotional responses. I'd done the right thing, it seemed. Okay, so if we look at the language choices in that text, I'm sure it was obvious to you already, but it's quite different from the other text. It does share some similarities though. So you can see highlighted in green there all the references to medical words and things that make it sound like a very organised effort. So there is a formality still there. So we've got lots of references to the word team. We've got phrases like daily briefing, centralised resources. We've got technical terms like isolation cubicles, ITU, ventilator spaces, 8 adult ventilated bed spaces. So there's still that kind of level of professional language, which obviously would link it with the first text, because that is somebody who's being very professional and formal as well. The difference, I think, though, is in the other language that's in this particular text. So we have in the purple highlighting 2 examples of language that could be considered figurative. So the first one, the metaphor, a storm in a distant place unearthers. So the actual description of the stories of the COVID infection from other countries, like it's almost coming from afar, like it builds a sense of tension of how bad this experience might be for them. And then her own reference to wanting the letter that she's written to sound like she was a commander and almost like the rest of the nurses and the people on the ward, the rest of the team were an army trying to battle this awful illness. So a really powerful use of language there. Also highlighted there in the orange are words that give a sense of how awful and how emotional the experience is. We've got horrendous ethical choices. We've got the reference to the metaphor our hell to describe what they expect it's going to be like. There's also references to stress, which is also emotive. In the more yellow highlighting there, we've got other emotive words, but these are a little bit more positive. So we've got a rule of 3 there: amazing, humbling, and incredible teamwork. But all those are emotive language as well. We've got references to we've got the adjective intense. We've got the verb to reassure, and we've got also the 2 nouns like understanding and reassurance, and also that phrase, a flood of lovely emotional responses. So lots of the language here, in contrast to the other text, is very emotional. And that's understandable because the perspective, the point of view of this writer is somebody who's right in the heart of what's happening, and that's communicated in the language choice. So when you do your comparison, what you need to do is to think about the perspective of the writer and how that impacts, and when you look at the choices made by the writer and how that perspective is reflected in those choices. So I think it's really useful before you start writing your response to do a quick plan. So if I were to make a comparison between these two texts about their viewpoint, this would be it. So the viewpoint of writer A is very much a scientific approach to research. He thinks there's a problem that he wants to solve. He sees it as a challenge in that respect. The writer's viewpoint in source B is it's a challenge as well. So there is a link there with source A, but here she's in the middle of fighting, literally fighting it, whereas the writer of source A is very much about finding what's caused the problem, so it doesn't happen again, rather than actually fighting the illness. Whereas the source B, it's working as a team, so they can work effectively to treat patients. And I think the other thing that comes across is that she sees fighting COVID almost like a military operation. The other thing you need to do is to think about what their views are and what methods they would use. So you might come up with ideas similar to this. So I think a similarity between the two texts is they have a very scientific and professional approach to the medical emergency they face. However, source A is more detached. He's not treating cholera cases, but he's examining and trying to find a solution, see what the cause is. Whereas source B is much more emotionally invested, as she talks about the preparations for the task ahead. The actual techniques, you can talk about the tone of source A, the detachment of it, whereas the tone of source B is much more emotional. We've got the language of the medical profession used in both, but in source B there is a much wider use of figurative language. So there's metaphors, there's a comparison with the army commander, and it's an awful lot more emotional. You would do if you were writing a response is obviously to start with point A, to home in on the point of view of point A and the techniques that are used, and then to bring in comparisons with point B. So there are some starters there that might show you how to structure your response. So it is useful to do as many examples of these. So do rewatch this video, but look at other texts and see if you can use the same approach to hopefully become much more focused and much more successful in how you approach question 4.